Hear me, Meg?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Sorry, there's dishwasher that's inconveniently the loudest part of its cycle at this exact moment.
It
So thanks for bearing
happens.
with me.
So, this is Meg Rowley. She is the managing editor at FanGraphs. She's also the host of FanGraphs Audio and a co-host on Effectively Wild. And as I mentioned, she is here to talk to us about what's going on with baseball today. We just heard about baseball in 1918. So now we're going to talk about baseball today and what's going on with the Cardinals, your favorite team, your favorite players. So if you go ahead and start throwing stuff into chat that you want me to bring up. But I think where we'll start, Meg, is the Cardinals of all places.
Sure.
So we had that little inconvenience where we had to quite a few games. And now that we're back playing with all of these double headers, I think we're starting to see all of the prospects being called into duty.
Sure.
First and foremost, probably Dylan Carlson, who everybody's been waiting years to see playing.
Yeah.
So what do you think about Carlson? Is he the real deal?
Sure. So I think right now they're in process, as I'm sure you all know. Very interesting of you to schedule this during a Cardinals doubleheader. I can't believe that anyone showed up. But he's obviously a very impressive prospect. We had him 39th on our preseason top 100 at FanGraphs. I think that he is likely to be slated for a corner as they're playing him now. We're pretty high on the bat, but he is part of this young core that they're bringing up. There are obviously going to be some guys who we don't see who spend their time developing at the alternate site this year, but he's there to sort of help spell this team as they get guys back from their outbreak, and also to make sure that no one's being played too much. There's a huge health concern beyond COVID that goes into a team having the experience that the Cardinals have had, which is we don't really know a lot about how the start and stop nature of this season is going to affect players. The obvious place where that's a problem is on the pitching side, and we've already seen a ton of pitchers across the league have a number of arm-related maladies, but it's not beyond the pale that we would see a number of soft tissue injuries from position players as well. So he's going to be an exciting part of this Cardinals team for a long time. He's obviously had all of 11 plate appearances so far, but we're pretty confident in the bat, even if he's not a long-term fit in center just because of how his speed plays. I think that if you're curious about sort of pegging him relative to some of his peers, the series that they had that short series they had against the White Sox this past weekend is instructive. So go back and kind of look at how Carlson took routes in the outfield and how he was playing, and then look at someone like Robert rather. It's not that we don't like Carlson, he's wonderful, but if you want to kind of think about how his defense works relative to some other guys who would be considered peers, I think Robert's a good one to sort of level set for yourself, which is not to say you shouldn't be excited about Carlson, but is just to kind of give you a better prospect context for him.
Maybe keep the Cardinals in check a little bit before they put out another huge salary offer to a player that's just and not maybe amazing.
He's quite exciting, but it's just always useful. We get so used to seeing our guys that it can just be good to kind of get a sense of what other teams are able to put on the field.
So we've got a question from Bo. Do you have any thoughts on Kramer Robertson and if we're going to see him this year?
Oh gosh, I will admit that I do.
Deep. Sorry.
Yeah, you are rapidly taxing.
I'll give you an easier one while you're searching.
Sure.
Which is, what are we thinking about Joe Kelly this year? And think the Cardinals traded him away a while ago, but where do we think he is?
He's obviously going to be the most famous for what his face has done lately. Yes. He's an interesting guy. I think that he is useful to that Dodgers bullpen, but they obviously have a lot of options available to them after he comes back from suspension anyway. But Joe Kelly's Joe Kelly. He's, got the famous stuff. The command continues to be a bit of a question even at this point in his career, but he had a good 6 innings before he decided to do to the Astros what I think a lot of people have wanted to do, even if we do not endorse throwing at hitters intentionally. So.
Yeah, and I think his face will be a meme for years to come, so it might be worth it just for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a good indicator to the league. I don't know quite how they would have gone about the discipline the Astros face differently, because I think you do want player participation to try to assess the extent of the scandal. Now, we can ask questions about how truthful players were, even with the option and knowledge that they weren't going to face suspension, but these guys take this stuff very seriously. I think the Astros might have thought that, given everything else going on, that that players would forget. But I think particularly for guys who, experience some consequence in their careers as a result of what the Astros did, even if it didn't cost Joe Kelly a World Series that year. I think it is going to continue to be an issue for them. So it'll be interesting to see how teams sort of adapt to this reality. The league is obviously not going to tolerate throwing at guys, but I don't imagine this is the last time we're going to ask questions about it.
So moving on from Joe Kelly to some other former Cardinals, getting a question from Morris, which is, do you think the Cardinals gave up on Lynn too early?
Lynn's really interesting. I don't know that anyone quite anticipated the resurgence he's had. And if you look at him, and I don't mean this as a knock on him, it's going to sound like I do, like, he does not look like a guy who is going to be doing what he's doing on the mound right now. I think he maybe took a similar approach to quarantine that we all did, in terms of enjoying a beer at the end of the day. But, he has had a pretty radical transformation in the last little bit. So I don't think that the Cardinals have to kick themselves for letting that one go. There were a number of stops along the way. So he's just going to continue to be this strange guy who is, running a sub 3 FIP right now and striking out 10 per 9 and just, racking up ground balls. So.
And one more former Cardinal we've got to bring up in this discussion, I think, is Trevor Rosenthal, who have come back, maybe?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of how that progresses with the season. So if you look at his pitch usage, he's throwing his four-seam fastball less often and his cutter and changeup more, and has seen sort of corresponding increases in the pitch values on each of those. So I don't know that we've seen quite enough from him yet to know if that's going to be a permanent shift, but I think there's a clear and intentional usage change that's gone on. So it'll be interesting to see how hitters sort of adapt to him. But yeah, he's having a surprisingly good year. He was not really on the radar for me coming into the season, and is pitching surprisingly well for a Kansas City team that's pretty exciting. I mean, they've elected to kind of not care so much about the service time considerations of their players, even though they're not really in a position to contend now, and promote guys like, Brady Singer and Chris Bubich. So they're an interesting team, and he's been a fun part of it. It's 10 innings, so we can kind of appreciate the small sample there, and it seems unlikely that he's going to maintain 100% left on base rate the entire season, but there is a clear change in his usage pattern, so it'll be something to watch over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, definitely. Came out of nowhere for me. I liked him for a while, and then I thought he was washed up, and I think got teams all over the country who thought he was washed up, and then here he is.
Yeah, and it's hard to know with so few innings last year kind of what was really real and what was a result of injury and whatnot. So it'll be interesting to see. This is clearly pretty exceptional based on his historical performance, but it might be a real shift given the change in usage.
Yeah. So what are you hearing about Carlos Martinez? We know he just got cleared for on-field activity. What is FanGraphs sort of thinking about him this year?
So let's see. I'm just pulling up our projections on him real quick. Bear with me 1 second.
No problem.
Navigating this and Zoom simultaneously is
always challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, so, based on what they had said about him sort of early in the season, it seemed like he had a firm rotation spot. I don't know how that's going to change given the delay that we've experienced here. I wouldn't put too much stock. I mean, he's barely thrown 4 innings, so don't let that 14 ERA scare you. But, we were not overly optimistic coming into the season. I think we're projecting an ERA and a FIP in the 4s for the rest of the way. But I think at this point, you just want to see him on the field and see what you actually get out of him before you try to jump to anything. We just don't know. He was put on the 10-day with an undisclosed injury designation, and I don't know anything above and beyond that. So I don't want to speculate that he, was diagnosed with COVID or tested positive. He may have been in the COVID protocol for reasons that don't result from a positive test, and it could be that he had something that was not COVID related. There are other undisclosed IL sort of considerations. So I don't want to speculate, but we just don't know a lot, assuming that it is that. We just don't know a lot about how that affects guys sort of long term. We've seen a real range. Freddie Freeman's playing great, and then you have guys on the Red Sox who are going to miss the whole season because of heart condition stuff. So I just, I'm careful to speculate with guys like that about sort of what their performance is going to look like this year and then into the early part of next year, because there is so much beyond the typical on-field pitcher considerations that we have to sort of take into account. But we'll just have to see.
So playing the Cardinals has sort of become a disadvantage now for teams because it's doubleheader after doubleheader after doubleheader. Yeah. So we live in our St. Louis bubble where we're, getting just St. Louis media for the most part. What up in the Pacific Northwest and then through FanGraphs, what are you guys thinking about the Cardinals' schedule? Is it doable, and teams that have to play us?
So I'm pretty skeptical that they will play something close to a full 60 games. You'll probably noticed in the announcement revising their schedule that the doubleheader that they were supposed to play against the Tigers is sort of TBD. I imagine that it'll depend on how close the playoff races are if they do that. And I don't have to tell Midwesterners what the weather has been like in the Midwest lately. So it's not as if COVID is the only thing that might impact their schedule. We're still optimistic about them from a playoff odds perspective. We have them at 62.1 odds to make the postseason, which is good. They're certainly beneficiaries along with everyone else of the expanded format this year, but it's going to be interesting to see both what they're able to do with the group they have right now and then what they might make of a larger group. There has been talk between the Players Association and the commissioner of expanding the potential pool of players that every team can draw on specifically for reasons like this. I know that there have been folks in the media, I don't know how far those sort of talks have gone, but there have been folks in the media saying that teams like the Cardinals or the Marlins should be exempt from some of the rules around sending guys back and forth from from the big league roster down to the alternate site, because many players would have to be exposed to waivers in order to make those moves. And obviously teams aren't going to want to do that depending on the guys who have options remaining. So I think that the ultimate state of that roster is still very much in flux, but it can't be good. I don't want to undersell it. Even only playing 7 innings at a stretch, it is a brutal schedule. When the revised schedule was announced, Jay Jaffe at FanGraphs did an update on it, and I think calculated that for the rest of the year, the Cardinals are sort of scheduled to average 10.4 innings a day that they're playing, which is, going to be very taxing not only on their position players, but you worry a great deal about the pitching staff and then the sort of counterbalancing measures that they might have to make in terms of their expanded 28-man to field more pitchers, but then have a shorter bench. So I think that they're a good team. They're a team that when we made our staff predictions, I said would go to the postseason. I said that Jack Flaherty would be the Cy Young. So I think with a more normal schedule, that would very much be on the table, but it's going to be a real slog. They're not the only ones, as you mentioned, who are going to have to deal with that, because it's had a huge consequence for the Central just generally, but it's not going to be an easy go. And unfortunately, because of the way that the playoff structure has been reformatted, some of the incentives teams have to win the division and not have to play in the wild card unless not get a couple of days off while that plays out, the Cardinals, even if they win the division, will not be able to take advantage of. So I think that the consequence for them is not just confined to the regular season, but now they are going to, if everything goes the way you guys want, play the slog and then go immediately into October. So it's going to be hard. They're a good team, but I think this is just going to be one of those things that we chalk up to a very strange 2020, and hopefully everyone emerges intact from a health perspective.
Yeah, that's the real goal, is that nobody's permanently injured from this. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what this season looks like. The first one being is baseball really comfortable with using winning percentage as that deciding factor, given the different schedules and everything?
So there is some precedent for this in some of the strike shortened seasons. I think that this is sort of the best solution they have available to them, even if it is potentially going to be at a disadvantage for some teams. I think that those concerns are counterbalanced by how broad the playoff field is this year. So remember, 8 teams from each league make it this year instead of the usual complement. So I think that they're trying to do the best with a very strange situation, but I do think that this is part of their desire to have teams like the Cardinals and the Marlins play as complete a schedule as possible, so that no one gets to the finish line and says, well, we played 5 more games and they're getting in just because their winning percentage is slightly better. So I think that's a big motivation for the league in terms of trying to get these guys to play as many games as they can.
Makes sense. You mentioned it's a weird season. So what do we think about some of these records that could potentially fall? I mean, we've got Blackman hitting well over 400, might still be hitting over 500. We've got people might be able to get the Triple Crown.
Yeah, so I think that the way that we have kind of thought about this at FanGraphs is that it is certainly not likely, but it is much more likely than it is in a typical year. Now, some of the guys who I had sort of early money on as potential guys to be in this mix were like, DJ LeMahieu, who's now going to miss potentially 3 weeks of the season with an injury. But when the season was getting underway, both Dan Szymborski and Craig Edwards at FanGraphs sort of took different approaches to calculate the odds of someone hitting 400. And Blackman's odds, when Craig did it, had a 0.11% chance, which was tied with Mike Trout. So that's something, and I think was the 7th highest in baseball. And then Dan's odds placed him somewhere around 0.36, which was 10th. So again, none of these odds are good, but they're significantly better than they are in a normal year. And I wish that some of them were a bit closer. It's fun to have a chase like that, right? It would be a nice distraction in a year like this where so much of the news is dire and, appropriately so, but quite dire. So I've been enjoying the hell out of Charlie Blackman hitting like that. There have been a lot of strange lines. You guys should go take a look at Carlos Santana's walk rate. It's not unusual that he would be walking a lot because he's Carlos Santana, but the degree to which he is walking a lot is pretty shocking. And I'm sure we'll be different in a couple of weeks. Pitchers will adjust. They're not pitching him particularly optimally right now. They're putting the ball in places where he doesn't typically swing, but there are a lot of kind of funky lines, and they're fun because they're allowed to last a lot longer into the year than they would in a normal 162 game slate. So
yeah, definitely. So you mentioned that things are a little different with our shorter slate of games. We've also seen a lot of strange rule changes this year.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
what do you think some of the lasting impacts of these rules changes might be?
Well, I hate to say this to fans of an NL club, because I know that NL fans are are more likely to be attached to pitchers hitting than AL fans. I grew up a Mariners fan watching Edgar Martinez, so the fact that anyone would want anything other than a DH is sort of unfathomable to me, but I think the universal DH is likely here to stay. We were sort of trending in that direction for a long time, and now that we've sort of gotten used to it, I think that we're likely to see that going forward. I think that some of the other changes aren't quite as likely. So I would be surprised if the 7-inning doubleheader rule sticks around. That is very much a rule of the moment, with the league trying to minimize the risk of both normal baseball injury and then COVID exposure in the course of a doubleheader. I'm 50-50 on the runner at second base rule. I think that I'm not personally a huge fan of it. I like the odd 20-inning slog. It's easier for me to say that because I live on the West Coast, so they tend to go a little less late into the night than they do for folks in the Midwest or on the East Coast. But I think that, you know, coming in, I was given to understand that that would be definitely a 2020 thing, and that's all. But I do wonder, given the reaction to it, if the league will explore making it a more permanent feature, because while we all like to hold on to our baseball traditions, I think that the reception to that has been more positive than they were perhaps anticipating. So I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up in the next round of CBA negotiations. But I think a lot of the 2020 rules are likely to be artifacts of 2020, and that we will look back on them as part of this strange season. Some of the other stuff that might change will require a bigger sort of longer term negotiation. So I think that some change to the playoff format is likely at some point, but a permanent change like that it has to be collectively bargained. Part of why this one came so late in the going, which, as a person who runs a baseball site that runs playoff odds, let me say how wonderful it was that baseball decided to change their playoff format hours before first pitch on opening day. But I think that we might see some expansion of the postseason. There's a lot of money to be had there. And I think that if the players and the league can kind of get together on some sort of revenue agreement that they find equitable, which is always a big if. And I think, you know, there are a lot of players and owners, for that matter, who have a bad taste in their mouth after the negotiations to resume play this year. But I imagine that we will see something along those lines, but it might be a little bit further down the road as both sides sort of gear up for the CBA to expire after the 2021 season.
Makes sense. Thinking about sort of the changes and everything, one thing that didn't really change is the timing of the trade deadline. So now we've got a trade deadline that's happening a month into the season.
Yeah.
So do you think there's going to be any movement there?
I don't quite know. So we're gearing up for it at FanGraphs as if it's going to be a normal busy day, because the alternative is us scrambling. We just started our trade value series today that Craig Edwards is taking over from Kylie McDaniel, who's gone to ESPN. We did that exercise because it's interesting to people, and because candidly, the guys who make that list don't often get traded at the deadline anyway. They don't often get traded within a year of making it to that list. But I think that it will be quieter than is normal. I think one thing that has shifted in the last week that might change the calculus there for some teams, though, is that there is a data and video sharing agreement that is circulating among teams to share information. So Hawkeye data and video where available, because it isn't available at every team's alternate site, but video from the alternate sites. Because one of the great dilemmas that teams face right now is, apart from the guys who are on the big league roster and playing every day, the prospects that have made their way into the 60-man player pool, some of those players teams haven't seen since the spring or last year in some cases, if you have guys coming back from injury. And the same is going to be true for major leaguers who are sort of on the roster bubble. So prior to that agreement sort of coming together, I thought that we would have a pretty quiet deadline. I still think it'll be relatively quiet, because even though you do see teams like, say, the Tigers, who are playing better than you might expect, even though they've now dipped under 500 and are calling up some of their big prospects, even though they weren't planning on contending this year, even though you've seen some of that stuff, I think that teams are pretty realistic about what this year means, which is that it's not really going to answer a ton of questions about the competitive nature of their rosters beyond what they're seeing at their own alternate training sites and the guys who are already on the big league roster, many of whom they're familiar with. So I don't think that if you're, say, a team that wants to be in the market for Francisco Lindor, you do that now. You might wait till the offseason for something like that because you want to be confident that you're getting a prospect haul that is meaningful. When we try to report on that stuff, it's tricky because the access to the alternate sites is so heavily restricted that the only people who we can really get information from, to the extent that we get information at all, are folks who work for the team. And they're not going to tell us if a guy's, K rate has spiked or his hammy's tweaked or his arm blew out or what have you. So I think that, before they had agreed to share some information, we were likely not to see much in the way of movement. We might see a bit more now. And, we thought that last deadline was a quiet deadline until about 2 p.m. West Coast time. And then 30 trades came in and Zach Greinke was on the Astros. So, that stuff can change really rapidly. But I think that the appetite for those kinds of big moves is going to be muted somewhat this year, especially because the playoff field is so large that you don't necessarily need to make the blockbuster trade in order to make it to the postseason. And given the format that it's taking, while you might have a worse seed, you're still going to be in the playoffs. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that shifts in the next little bit. But I imagine it'll be quieter than normal.
Yeah. Speaking sort of blockbuster moves, we saw the Diamondbacks pick up Madison Bumgarner, a lot of big pitching. Not looking good for them right now.
No, they've had a bit of a better go of it of late, and it's so funny to say of late in a season that's like 3 weeks old. But he has not looked good. The velocity has continued to decline. It'll be interesting to see how much of his injury was really an injury, how much of it is an opportunity to get a reset. But yeah, that has not really come together for them. They obviously are going to be down a couple of guys this year. Mike Leake opted out of the season, so they had that hole to fill. They have some interesting young pitching talent, but I think that they don't really have an ace to anchor that team right now, and the Bumgarner deal is not looking great at the moment. Their bullpen is pitching a little bit better than the rotation, but even there, they're in the bottom half of the league. So that's been clearly a concern. They also weren't hitting really all that much in the early going, and the offense has picked up some. So that's gonna help things. But it did not look good. It's a bummer. Bumgarner is a lot of fun when he's working, and it's not working right now.
Yeah, definitely. So we know that the Diamondbacks have had some issues. We talked about some other teams. But who do you think a season this short benefits? I mean, who's really going to come out ahead just by playing such a short season?
So it kind of depends what we mean by that. The answer to this has changed for me even in just the last couple of days. I think the obvious answer going into the regular season was the Yankees, as if the Yankees need more help. But when you look at teams like the Yankees, where they had significant player injuries going into the season that were going to delay key starters until the middle part of the year, they've gotten some of those guys back. Now, some of those guys have subsequently gone on the injured list. So both Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton would have started the year on the IL under a normal schedule. They got a couple weeks in and are now on the IL again. The timeline for Giancarlo is a little less certain. It sounds like Judge will be back as soon as his 10 days are up. But they've also lost guys like DJ LeMahieu. So the Yankees were going to be my answer. I think they probably still are on balance, even with Judge going down and Giancarlo going down. They're able to bring someone like Paxton back right away. His first couple starts were pretty rough, but he seems to be commanding the fastball better, so that's looking a little bit better now. So you have teams like that where there is a consideration on the roster that's really changed now versus March or April, and then you have teams that were sort of fringe playoff contenders, but because of the change in playoff format are going to be in a better position than they would have been just by virtue of more teams getting in. So, I would imagine that we will have, say, an NL East heavy representation because of some of the teams that are there. And then you just have, the benefit of a hot start in a season like this where if you go 10-2 in your first 12 in a 60-game season, that's a pretty significant portion of your season. So teams that were able to get out of the gate like that, and then teams that had significant depth. So the Yankees come to mind here again, but a team like the Dodgers where you have guys who aren't necessarily hurt but aren't sort of playing up to expectation in the early going, you can afford, as crazy as it sounds, to have a couple bad weeks from Cody Bellinger because he's swinging at everything outside of the strike zone, when you also have Mookie Betts and you have an AJ Pollock who's hitting really well, and you have Corey Seager looking like his sort of MVP candidate self when he's not dealing with his own back considerations. So I think that, teams that have a significant amount of depth and are able to weather either poor performance in the early going or injury are always going to do well, and are especially going to do well in a year like this because injuries aren't prorated in a short season, right? It takes as long to come back from a tweaked hamstring as it does, and you just have less time to get healthy. So I think teams that are able to supplement their rosters with depth, either because they're pretty stacked on the big league roster or because they have, significant prospects who they're comfortable bringing up from the alternate side, are going to be in a good position.
Yeah, the Dodgers, who can take a top prospect catcher, put him on the IL, and just bring in a new one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I thought that they would be the World Series favorite going into this year. I have to diminish my expectations somewhat just because the playoff format change means that everyone's going to have a slightly harder time advancing. But I think if they're able to get past that first round, they're the favorites to me. I mean, they look incredible. Dustin May is an amazing addition to that rotation. They have outfielders for days. I'm sure Cody Bellinger will figure out how to stop swinging at back foot breaking balls eventually. And then they're going to just plow through the
Finally
National
get
League.
Kershaw that ring that I've been waiting for.
Yeah. I mean, you're in good shape when a slightly diminished version of Clayton Kershaw is like not really a problem for your rotation. So.
So going back to the Cardinals, we talked a little bit about the different site, the off-site or whatever they called it. I don't ever remember.
The alternate site. It's just
site. Thank you.
a truly terrible name. It sounds quite dystopian in our broader dystopian moment.
Do you think the Cardinals may actually have a long-term advantage because they're getting to see some of these players against Major League hitting just because of all our double headers?
I think that it kind of depends on the prospect. So I think that there are definitely guys where you're going to, there's like nothing else for them to do at the minor league level, and it's better for them to get reps, even if they're hard reps against big league pitching than it is for them to sit out. The guys from a player development perspective that I think are in a bad situation, not just for the Cardinals, but for, the entirety of the majors, are the minor leaguers who are not at the alternate site, where what they are able to do, the, sort of resources they have access to are going to be widely variable. And even though all of the teams in baseball are doing their best to sort of drive player development, like, we're all on Zoom right now, and I can see some of you, but if we were all sitting together in an auditorium, we'd have rapport and we'd be able to take questions live. Imagine trying to figure out how to hit big league pitching on Zoom, right? Like, that feels like an impossible task, and teams are doing the best they can, but I think that it's going to be tricky. It's nice to see teams like the Cardinals are sort of giving a chance to their younger guys and seeing them as part of a playoff push this year, and giving them the opportunity to sort of get big league hacks in. But I think that we will feel the effects of this season of player development on prospects for a long time to come, and some of them are going to be able to adapt to it just fine, and I think others are really going to struggle, either because the format isn't conducive to them to sort of do what they need to, or because their actual sort of physical ability to play the way that they need to, whether it's, having access to a batting cage or, a Rapsodo or whatever, is going to be variable. So that part's going to be tricky for everyone.
Yeah. Now, we wouldn't be talking to a crowd of Cardinals fans without asking about Yadier Molina. So obviously he was one of the players that announced he had COVID.
Yeah.
He's hopefully going to come back, but where do you see Yadi going? How many more years? What are you guys projecting?
So I don't know that this is the right decision for St. Louis, but I have a hard time believing that Yadi's going to be done before he's ready. Now he is a free agent in 2021. His deal is up after this year, and the Cardinals do have catching prospects who are more intriguing, but they've also shown a willingness to deal some of those guys, not the guys they currently have, obviously, but to deal catchers to sort of make way for Yadi to continue to have his shot at that position. Now, I think that he is going to have missed significant time. He's 38. He won't have a contract for next year necessarily. So on the one hand, I would be surprised if, depending on how quickly he's able to come back and sort of what the postseason picture looks like for them, I think the affection within the organization for him and the fan base is quite real. But he is not projected to be a particularly productive player this year. And I think that his sort of long-term projections are not significantly better. So I hope that, let's put it this way, I hope that he is able to come back healthy and at full steam at some point this year, because it would be a real shame if this were the last sort of hurrah that he gets, given his importance in the franchise. I mean, his Zips projections say for 2021 is that he will be a 1-win player, which is, better than replacement level, but not by much. And you don't want him to block players who are going to be more productive. So we should all start saying goodbye to Yadi and appreciate the time we had with him.
I hate to say it, but I think that in St. Louis, everybody's rooting for him to come back and play as many more years as he wants, whether it's smart or
right.
not.
Yeah, and I think the organization, like I said, has shown a willingness to sort of accommodate that, but there is going to come a time where it starts to get ridiculous. I mean, this is just a terribly mean way of putting this, so I apologize in advance. You wanna let Albert Pujols leave town before the Angels contract, not after, right? So that's the kind of decline you're looking to avoid. Now, he isn't anywhere near where Albert is, unfortunately, in terms of his production, but I think that it's coming time soon.
Now, I know you're not Jay, but
No.
Where do we think Yadi falls in terms of Hall of Fame?
Oh, goodness. That is a terrific question that I'd like to give a more specific answer to. And so I will navigate over to...
So I said, I know you're not Jay and not going to be able to do this off the top of your head.
Yeah. Bear with me one brief moment and let me see how quickly I can navigate Baseball Reference. So right now, so Jay Jaffe has, and I apologize for those of you who are already familiar with his work. So he created a system called JAWS, which looks at sort of the worthiness of a player for the Hall of Fame, and it combines both sort of their peak production years and then their sort of overall production. And if we look at the catcher JAWS leaders, Yadi grades out pretty well. So among active players who, and I'm just scrolling through this to make sure that this is right, because for some reason Baseball Reference thinks that Joe Mauer is still active, and that's not accurate. But so he's second to Buster Posey in terms of active players who have done the bulk of their time at the catcher position. He's at 40.1 wins above replacement at Baseball Reference, and the standard at catcher for career is 52.7 and at peak is 34.4. So he has some ways to go, but I think that when you look at his load faster, goodness, BREF, you're letting me down. So his JAWS score is 34.4, and the average JAWS score for the catcher position is letting me down with my internet, is 44. So he's within 10, which means that he will not be a surefire Hall of Famer, but it will also be interesting to see sort of how his defensive reputation plays into that, the place that he occupies within the franchise. The pure statistical case is not quite there, but the pure statistical case is not all that Hall of Fame voters take into consideration. And I think that there's a significant amount of affection for Yadi, especially among the St. Louis folks in the BBWA. So I don't think that he, barring, a resurgence in the last couple of years of his career, is necessarily a first ballot guy. But if he's able to accrue a few more wins, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think you're probably about right. Couple more quick questions. Looking at the NL Central, where do you think this is going to play out as we get to 50, 60 games in terms of the playoffs?
Yeah, so right now, just to give everyone sort of a baseline of where our playoff odds are, we have the Central grouped pretty tightly together. So the Cubs, with their 13-7 start, are at 93% odds to make the postseason. They're the division favorite, but remember, the division first winner and second place team make the playoffs this year. Beyond that, in terms of playoff odds, we then have the Brewers, the Cardinals, and then the Reds. All of those teams have playoff odds above 50%. Indeed, they all have playoff odds above 56%. So some of that is how tightly clustered the division is. It was one of the most tightly clustered divisions we had coming into the season, which was a result, candidly, of there not being a runaway favorite in the division or a real juggernaut, unlike, say, the NL East, where we also viewed it as highly contested, but that was because many of the teams in that were thought to be pretty high quality, although I think we probably hadn't gotten a look at the Phillies bullpen before we made those odds. But I think that the unfortunate reality for St. Louis is that because of the doubleheaders, you have a difficult strength of schedule that's not really being reflected in our strength of schedule metric, because we just there's not an easy way to incorporate, what is it? You guys have like 9, 11, 47 doubleheaders over the next 6 weeks. I mean, I think that when the schedule change came out, St. Louis was slated to play like 22 games in the half month or something like that. So we're probably underselling the strength of schedule challenge that St. Louis faces, but they are very much in the mix. I think that the Cubs, Brewers, and Cardinals are all kind of going to be in that mix. It's going to feel strange looking at those standings for a long time because of how few games St. Louis has played. But it's going to make doubleheaders like today's, where you're in a position to take 2 from the team at the top of the division, all the more important, not only because it has an immediate impact on the standings and wins are good, but I have a feeling that if we get in a position where baseball is needing to prioritize what parts of the schedule they keep on the books versus what they allow St. Louis to postpone, as we get further down the stretch and it becomes clear just how much of that remaining schedule they're able to play, my guess would be that they will prioritize division play over interleague play. And so you really want to take as many of these games as you can. And for those who don't have your game on your second screen, which I imagine is many of you, you've taken a 2-1 lead in the top of the 4th. So good job.
Nice. And we won the first game of the doubleheader. So
yeah,
take 2 from the Cubs. It's always good. Yeah,
but I think it's going to be as it always was. It'll just feel weirder. It's going to be a knockdown drag out until the end of the season, I would imagine.
Yeah, I agree. So now you've talked a lot about some of your FanGraphs products throughout this, but do you want to give everybody an overview of what they can find on FanGraphs and what products you have for them?
Sure. So I don't know how familiar everyone is, but I think that one of the things that makes FanGraphs really special as a place for the baseball community to come together is that we pair really great statistical tools and leaderboards with wonderful expert analysis. So if what you're looking for is a really smart baseball writer to help you understand the current landscape, there's going to be a piece for you to read. If you want to be able to run, detailed splits leaderboards and understand how your team is doing against left-handed pitching at home, you can use our tools to find that information. So there's stuff there for the statistical enthusiast, the analytics enthusiast. There's a lot there for people who appreciate good writing. If you are keen on prospects, we have a wide array of prospect coverage. Eric Longenhagen, our lead prospect analyst, is really terrific. So I think there's something there for everyone, and we keep improving the site. So within the last couple of weeks, we've launched custom leaderboards for this year. We thought people would want to know, what are the best and worst 60-game spans that a team or a player has ever had, right? Because I've asked that question. I'm like, where does this stack up against, other strange nonsense that we've had over the course of baseball? Well, we have leaderboards specifically for that. We thought that people would want to be able to find the most commonly used StatCast metrics. So you can find some StatCast metrics on FanGraphs. You don't have to toggle back and forth between Baseball Savant and FanGraphs if you want to look at exit velocity or the number of barrels that a player has. So we're constantly trying to improve the site. Everything at FanGraphs is free to use. Every article is free to read. Every tool is free to use. As you might imagine, this has been a really taxing time for a baseball website. Until recently, we had no baseball, and so we had a lot fewer people reading. So if you go to FanGraphs and you find stuff you like and you are using the leaderboards a lot and you notice, hey, these kind of drag a little bit with ads, you can buy an ad-free membership and get rid of ads and help out the site. So I'll give a little plug for that. But if there's a thing about baseball you're interested in, we probably have something to satisfy whatever that urge is, to help you scratch that itch. And if there's stuff that you'd like to see at the site that we don't currently have, we always like to hear from readers about what's interesting to them. So, whether it's those 60-game spans, which came from Ben Lindbergh asking a question of our developer that took a big query, and then our developer saying, hey, I can build that into a leaderboard, or readers asking for StatCast stuff. That's a reader request. We take feedback from all sorts. So if you don't see something there and it's something you think we can build, let us know.
Awesome. Yeah, FanGraphs is great. If you're not on it, you definitely should be. They have a lot of amazing articles. One last question that came in under the wire is, do you have any sense of whether the Cardinals are going to be on the same schedule for roster reduction as everybody else, or are we going to get some sort of leeway because of the COVID?
So the Players Association, my understanding is that the Players Association and the league voted to keep the 28-man for every team for the duration of the season, in part because of the outbreak. So everyone had to go down to 28, but then that's going to be the remainder. If anything, rosters will grow rather than shrink. So that hasn't been agreed to, but there has been talk of, like I said, expanded rosters at the alternate training sites, and then that might end up filtering up to the big league roster. We just don't know that part yet, but you'll get to keep the 28 man roster along with everybody else, and then you might see more in the coming weeks, depending on what the state of COVID is across the league and sort of what the perceived need is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming out and joining us. I always appreciate it when you're willing to hop on and chat.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate getting to see everyone, even if it's over Zoom.
Thank you, and I'm sure, talk to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Bye, everyone.
Bye.